But I want to welcome everyone to our first YALSA webinar related to the teen services competencies for library staff. Really excited that we're kicking this off with the first content area, which is teen growth and development. And we're going to each month focus in on a different topic and from the competencies, and some will be big picture, which we're doing today about teen growth and development, and some will be more granular in terms of what's in the competencies. I think everybody knows how to use chat because it seems like it's working. In case
chat is working.
Yep. So in case you don't, just click on the bottom and you'll see the chat. And also, if you like to pop the chat out, if you haven't done that already, there's a little down arrow at the top of the chat, and you can pop it out so you can move it around the screen. And sometimes people really like that because it helps to make the slides more visible. So I'm going to introduce Yuta, and actually, Yuta, I'm going to mostly let you introduce yourself. But Yuta is at Cornell, and she works with youth. Act for Youth. Act for Youth? Did I do that right?
Act for Youth, right.
Yeah, and they do a lot of work with positive youth development and helping people better succeed in working with youth. And for this session, she's going to be talking about positive youth development and youth engagement and how all the things align. So Yuta, you are on, and feel free to, I'm just going to say one other thing, feel free to keep asking questions and chatting, and we'll collect those as we go. And I also know that Yuta has time for people to be talking during the session. Now
okay, great. Okay, well, thank you. Welcome, everybody. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. This is me in a better picture. My name is Jutta Dotovich, and I'm a director of training for the Act for Youth Center here at Cornell University. And I've been involved in working with community projects around youth development, positive youth development, and also in the arena of adolescent sexual health. If you're wondering where this name comes from, I'm originally from Germany, but I came over like 35 years ago, and I've been working in mental health in various capacities in New Jersey and New York, and ended up at Cornell University like 20 years ago. So and since then, I've been spending a lot of time in training material development, and focused a lot around youth services and working with young people. So that's where I'm coming from. And that's my contact information. So you have access to the slides later. So there are links embedded in it. So you can also send me questions if you have them later on. I thought what we could do today, talk a little bit about what is positive youth development, what are the foundation pieces for this, what does this really mean for our work with young people, how we look at young people, talk about some of the key principles. But I also want to talk a little bit background information, look at adolescent development and what we know now about the adolescent brain, how that feeds into how we work with young people. And so I think we'll get a good picture of, I mean, it might change, I hope I would change your mind and how you look at young people and how you work with them. So that's my agenda for the day. And we did this already here. We looked at some of the housekeeping details because we chatted already for a while. So you know how to use the chat function. And if you post it to everyone, everybody can see it. Sometimes if you're running several programs at the same time, this will delay your viewing. So it might help to turn, close some of the windows that you have open at the same time. So I was inspired by the recent youth activism around gun control after the Florida shooting. So I used a lot of pictures from there since we're talking about youth voice and youth engagement in a little while. So I thought this is a really, this is a great moment in time to really see what youth activism can look like. And that's certainly a piece of the youth development approach. So I want to just take a few minutes to talk about what we consider positive youth development, because there are different definitions out there and people have different understanding. So for some folks, it's really talking about child and adolescent development. For some folks, it means youth services in a community or in a county or even in the state. For other folks, it's really a philosophy or an approach. And for us, it's really the later piece. it's the philosophy or the approach and how you're working with young people. And it kind of embeds all the other points as well, because it considers adolescent development. What do we know about how adolescents develop socially, cognitively, physically, sexually, etc. And it embeds on how do we provide services and programs to young people in a community to really help them thrive and learn the skills they need to learn. So just to clear, I mean, I always put this in there because I feel people do get to these buzzwords, and positive youth development has been a buzzword for a while, and they just mean different things. So for us, or for now, I want to really call it a philosophy or an approach, and we'll define it in a minute. But before we define it, I want to just show a couple of the main theories that we use in this approach. And this is Yuri Bronfenbrenner's ecological model of human development.
That's why.
Some of you might want to mute your mic, because otherwise we're going to get lots of people talking. Yuri's ecological model of development. Did I get muted? No. This model has been, I think, very helpful because it looks at the social context that young people grow up in. So you have the young person in the center, you have the closest system they're interacting with is the family or a caretaker, if it's not the biological family. And then you have other social subsystems that interact with the young person and influence his development. And then ultimately you have neighborhoods, you have communities, you have society, but you also now have the cyberspace. You have the internet, which adds another layer of complexity to human development. But Yuri is also recognizing this is not a one-way street. Young people are not just influenced by their social context and by the people they encounter and interact with, they also have agency. They influence how those subsystems function. So they have choice, they can go different directions, they can make decisions, and that sense of agency, which is really important for development, we'll pick up later on when we talk about some of the key principles of youth development. Because young people need that sense of agency to really develop well and be productive later on. The other theory that we use in this approach is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And Maslow has been around since the 40s. And we now have actually more and more research that kind of support his theory that we do have these different needs that have to be met before people can feel really happy and fulfilled. And the ones I really want to highlight are the bottom three, which we now know as the foundational needs. If these are not met, if the physiological needs are not met, the safety needs and the sense of belonging and love, if those needs are not met, young people do not thrive. And you will encounter young people in your libraries that live in very difficult living situations, and their focus is on survival, on where they get food and shelter for the night, and they are not focused on learning and doing well in school. So I think this is for us kind of a reminder that not all young people have the conditions and the support they need to really do well. And if these needs are not met, then their functioning is not doing too well. And so along those lines, we know from other social sociologists and psychologists like Jim Carino, that there are lots of issues out there that interfere with young people's well-being, and he calls it social toxicity. And he did a lot of books, and you might have read some of his books about the school shooting in Colorado and young people who committed crimes and who are in secure prisons. Young people grow up with a lot of those issues, and also, we made some strides maybe in some of these areas. We're still facing a lot of communities and a lot of, in our society, a lot of areas where young people face these threats. And if it's poverty, if it's racism, if it's sexism, if it's homophobia, or if it's others, the domestic violence being a really main issue that can really influence young people's trajectory and well-being. There are lots of issues that get in the way and that kind of poison young people's well-being. So that's kind of reality shot, that we know we are not we are not, we as a society, we still have a lot of work to do to really provide young people with the right conditions to grow up well and productive. So, yeah.
A quick question. How do you spell the author's last name?
Oh, Garbarino.
Yeah.
Garbarino. James Garbarino.
Okay, I'm putting it in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah. I know his books are very interesting to read. He did. I can send you the names later on. So.
Great.
So he is an interesting guy. But there are other, like you all probably heard about the ACEs study that finally is getting some attention. This kind of repeats the same thing. We know that there are a lot of conditions and that young people grow up in that interfere with their healthy development. So he's kind of stating the same thing in this analysis, and he's a social psychologist. So we have also some research that supports the youth development framework. For one, we have prevention research that really looked at what predicts and prevents poor health outcomes, and we have a huge body of research that looks at risk and protective factors, and many of you are probably familiar with this. We look at things like poverty, which is really an accumulation of risk factors, and what happens to young people growing up in these conditions, and what can we do in terms of buffering that experience with protective factors to improve outcomes or delay negative outcomes. Resiliency research looked at the same risk and protective factors, but they looked at long-term studies. The most famous one was done in Hawaii, which is a great place to do research when you have to come back every year for like 20 years, and looked at a cohort of young people that faced several risk factors, and they followed them for 40 years and without any interventions, and they just monitored how did they develop, and they realized there are a lot of protective factors, internal as well as external, that help people overcome the odds and overcome adversity. And so that's what resiliency research focused on, and there are also intensive case studies and other studies that look at this. And then the youth development research is really a body of research that just looked at what does it take for young people to do well? How do we create thriving, or how do we predict thriving? And they're not so much concerned about the problems. They want to really look at what do young people need to do well. And so all of this kind of fed into the youth development approach. And here's like a definition of what we mean by positive youth development. And so I said it's a philosophy or an approach, and it's really community-based. It's a big picture approach that guides communities and the way they organize programs, supports, and opportunities so that all young people can develop to their full potential. Now, that's a very general statement, a very lofty goal, but it provides some direction in how we look at what we do for and with young people in communities. So for one, it's moving away from this problem focus. A lot of, coming from prevention and other research areas, we always look at problems. And unfortunately, we are kind of back in this swing of looking at problems to provide services. But we really should focus, we want to really focus on building positive outcomes and what do young people need to thrive. Karen Pittman is one of the big promoters of positive youth development in this country, and she comes up with really catchy phrases. And one of her phrases is, problem-free is not fully prepared, which is true. If a person is problem-free, they don't drink, they don't use drugs, they didn't get pregnant as a teenager, what does it say about them? So we still don't have them prepared for adult life, for further education or for work and for life. So what is it that young people need? And this is what we want to build, these positive outcomes. The other principle is key youth voice and engagement, that we bring young people to the table, because young people do have their own perspectives they bring in, and I think it's very important to hear how they look at things and what they see is happening. And they are the experts on where they are, because we were all 14 at some point, but 14-year-olds now face a very different reality than we did, depending on how old you are when you were 14. So I think it's important to bring their perspectives in and also engage them in the process. And that refers back to this sense, development happens when people have also agency, when they can make choices, they can make decisions, they have a say on what they do. And the other key principle is long-term involvement. We can't do these quick fixes. So it's really the picture is like, what do we do with young people over their developmental span? 12-year-olds and 14-year-olds and 16-year-olds do need different things. They need different opportunities, but they also need ongoing support. They're not just one-time shot in the arm and one program that lasts for like 4 weeks. And we're looking at universal approaches more so because they're more inclusive. Instead of targeting young people, which we often do when we have a problem-focused approach, we target the high-risk youth, the so-called high-risk youth, or we target gifted young people. But the vast majority of young people might not fall into those categories. And so really using a universal approach, thinking about young people overall and their different manifestations, the different groups they belong to, I think is the best way to do programming. And it all implies that we work on a community base, that we're working together collaborative, and that everybody has kind of a part to play in this. It's not just one program that does this work, or one agency, or one person. So that's the overall definition we use. It's a very generic or very big picture definition. If you have any comments or questions about this, let me know. And I need to open the chat room for this, or maybe Linda, you could monitor the chat if there are any questions about this.
Yes, I've been monitoring the chat, and let's see, there haven't been questions, but are there questions about anything so far?
Maybe it comes later. I mean, it's no. This is kind of just the overall picture, and it's going pretty fast, but I feel like probably some of you know some of those theories and the research that's behind it. But before we get into some of these key principles, let's step back a second and talk a little bit about adolescent development, because with the recent progress in brain research and imaging, we know a lot more on how the adolescent brain works and how the brain works in general. So, and that has some impact, I think, on how we approach young people, how we work with them. So when you think about adolescence, most people think of this, risk-taking. People get into all kinds of trouble. They're into speed, they're into excitement, they're into having fun, sometimes extreme fun. So adolescence, what is adolescence? It's really starting earlier and earlier. So right now, on average, girls start between 8 and 10. Boys are usually 2 years behind. Now the question for you is, when does it end? When does adolescence end? There's a lot of debate about this. When does it end? Any ideas? Anybody chatting in, Linda?
Yes, yeah, I have to keep going to unmute. Yes, so we have 25, 26, a lot of mid-20s.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. That's really accurate.
20s, actually, 20s.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you think about this, yeah, so this is accurate. This is what a lot of people say now, that adolescence goes up to 25 because that is kind of linked to adolescent brain development. But it also means that adolescence is the longest it's ever been in documented history. So because it starts earlier, like if you start as some girls start at 8, so they're still in elementary school, not even at the end of elementary school, and it lasts till the mid-20s. That's a long time. And adolescence is really a time that is of great vulnerability, but also of great opportunity, and we'll get to this in a second. So adolescence, the way, when you look at what does adolescence mean in terms of what young people have to kind of adjust to and develop, how they develop, there are lots of things going on. So one is they have changing bodies and they're changing emotions, so they're going through lots of changes physically and emotionally. Their cognitive thinking becomes much more abstract and rational. They can take complex perspectives. They develop new emotional skills and coping skills. They develop their own moral standards and values and beliefs, and they test them. They understand complex experiences. They change how they look at friendships. They start their first intimate relationships. They also they try out different roles and try on different responsibilities, and they renegotiate and how they connect and interact with adults. So there's a lot of stuff happening on many levels in different domains. It's a very busy time. It's a very complex time that is very demanding. So sometimes we forget all the stuff they're going through. And it really all starts with puberty and also with what happens in the brain. And brain really triggers puberty. And with puberty, we see another enormous growth spurt in the brain. So we see a major growth spurt in the beginning from birth to 3 when the brain is really starting to proliferate, all the connections they're making. So you see these little guys learning how to use their bodies, how to speak. There are all these developments happening, and the wiring in the brain is really foundational at the time. And then with puberty, we see another growth spurt starting, and there it's more about efficiency and proficiency. So instead of creating lots of more connections, the brain is becoming much more efficient, and so the nerves that fire together are wired together. So it really means that, like when you see adolescents develop skills like in sports or in music or in art, they create really fast highways in their brains that are much more proficient and efficient than having all the wiring they had before. So instead of having 10 brain centers light up when they, let's say, play piano or they play soccer, we have only like 2 areas that are now involved in this because they are so efficient and the connections are so dense that they can do this much quicker and faster and better. So it's really looking, I like this analogy from a presentation you can go to that a neuroscientist was giving about the developing brain. And it's really like, if you look at the brain like a community, you have the building blocks, which are the cells, and then that form the gray matter. There are millions of those out there in the brain. And then the nerves create these highways or streets in between parts of the brain. And the thicker the highway, or the thicker the street, the connection is, the faster the highway. So you have freeways and you have smaller roads. And you have major centers, and some of the centers come online faster than others or an earlier time, and they get connected with each other and become more efficient working together. And all this is kind of influenced by interacting with the environment. So stimulation activity really has an impact on brain development and how the pathways work, and nutrition as well. So this is an important thing to recognize. So the brain is always rewiring, it's very plastic, it has enormous potential, but there are a lot of foundations laid in the beginning, but they can be rewired. So there's a lot of that, but it depends on how the brain is stimulated, how the person is stimulated, what opportunities they have, and how much support they get. This is not just saying that there are different maturation speed levels, basically. So the cerebellum is like the first center comes on, and that kind of controls the body heat, the blood circulation, and all that stuff. So it makes the body function. And then the limbic system comes online, which is the emotional center of the brain that has been very important in our survival as a species. And then the prefrontal cortex comes online last, and that's why now adolescence often is regarded as the time span, or that period ends at age 25. That's overall the time when the prefrontal cortex matures and comes online fully. And that's the decision-making center. So let's take a look at those. So the limbic system is the emotional center and the reward center. And it gets aroused very easily by whatever happens in the environment. And if there's something desirable, something rewarding, something exciting out there, it gets stimulated and gets very active. But it was initially for our species an important center to come online first, because in our survival is the fight and flight reaction is triggered by the limbic system. So if something is threatening us, we either run away or we fight back or we freeze maybe, but that's an important reaction that helped our survival. But it also helped our survival to be excited by new things, by exploration and by excitement. So that helped us as a species to move into new territories and try out new things. So it has definitely a positive quality, and we should keep that in mind when we think about adolescence. And then the prefrontal cortex is the rational decision making, where you have executive functions that control with, our thinking, judgment, attention, planning, and that comes really online fully at age 25. Now, some people say for some folks, it never comes online fully. So, but this is something that doesn't work as well when the limbic system is aroused. So when we think about adolescence, when the limbic system is aroused, when the emotional center is active, then often the prefrontal cortex takes second seats. It's not the first thing that they can do. Even if they have the knowledge and they know what the consequences of certain behaviors are, if the limbic system is engaged and there are rewards or excitement to be had, then young people will make different decisions. The other piece that we know a little bit more about is really the adolescent social brain that is connected with the limbic system and is in the neighborhood of the limbic system. And so we recognize that adolescents often misinterpret facial expressions, and they misinterpret or overinterpret social cues from their peers. If you're parents, you know this, or working with teens in any setting, you probably have learned that if you talk a little more stern or a little firmer, that might be interpreted as you're yelling at them. Very common thing. So they overinterpret or falsely interpret facial expressions and can take it really as an anger and take off. So you might get a reaction you didn't expect. So that was just a very fast overview of the adolescent development with really a focus on what's happening in the brain. Any takeaways for you? Anything that maybe was new, or anything that you'll remember most about this?
And people can unmute themselves if you'd like, or type it in, but I have I'm going to take you back for a minute because there was a question that came up earlier.
Yep.
And you mentioned something about a universal inclusive approach.
Right.
And the question was about, are you thinking that when library staff develop programs and activities for teens, it should be like for all teens and not just troubled or gifted youth, not separating them out, but really focusing on the whole group?
Right. I mean, that's the idea behind it. I mean, to have more general approach for that age group. And not, we know from research that if you're putting together young people with risky behavior, at high risk that got into trouble for whatever reason, you put them together for programming, they get into more trouble. They learn from each other negative things, and it doesn't really help. So even if it's like a skill building program that you're putting together that's supposed to teach them something, or it's supportive, if you're just bringing young people together that like they're all in the juvenile justice system, or they're all in trouble for whatever reason, or I used to work for teen parents, then they don't like to be necessarily all together either. And so they learn more if it's a more general group, and they also have teens, they come from different backgrounds, and it creates more inclusive, more, I think, better environment for them to learn from each other as well as from the presenter or the group leader. And we also know from research that folks who looked at universal approaches, like that was coming from underdeveloped countries, doing interventions there, and that kids that did one intervention, and the kids who benefited the most from this intervention were kids at higher risk that usually had less opportunities to learn. But they had this opportunity like everybody else coming together from that group, and they learned more than the kids who already had some skills and have more opportunity to learn that well. So it's kind of interesting. But we tend to group people by these criteria, and it's not a good thing. We have research to show it doesn't work and makes sometimes problems worse. But that's often how funding is kind of forcing this issue. And this is the problem with evidence-based and politics and decision-making. that sometimes the evidence base doesn't really carry all the way through. I mean, you don't get that there because people have their personal experiences, and if there's a feel-good moment, the same way we had with DARE, you know, which got really terrible evaluations and is still a popular program for a long time. So
there's some great conversation and questions here. Even Lady Gaga is being mentioned.
Lady Gaga, what is the question about Lady Gaga?
People are saying how awesome that was, but there are a couple of questions. Somebody's saying, how would you recommend trying to be authoritative with teens without them interpreting you as yelling?
Yeah, well, I think we'll talk about this. Let's hold this question until we talk about youth engagement.
Okay.
Right. I know group, I think when you're in group settings where things can get out of control, I think it's really good to do group agreements and have them come up with the agreements and have them posted in the room so you can refer back to the agreement so you don't have to be the heavy guy. Often young people are tougher on the rules and agreements than the adults who are, you know, the program leaders. So that's one way to kind of keep control, to have group agreements that they came up with, and you post them and remind them again of that if you don't want to, you know, come down as a heavy, to keep some order in the group. But I have a couple of other ideas we'll talk about a little later.
And this question might also be a little later, but when discussing the idea of teens responding more to rewards than negative reactions, has it been suggested to emphasize positive rewards over punishment?
Good point. I think we should really think about this because we all know, and we'll talk about this actually in a minute, we all know by highlighting your weak spots and what you do wrong is not making you do anything better. I mean, nobody likes to be we focus on the problem all the time. It's better to identify what are you good at and build on that. And what is your interest? What is your passion? Let's build on this to get some other skills going. That is much more engaging than to send you there because you really don't know how to do this and you need to learn how to do this. That kind of gets you going already from the get-go, like you're a failure and you can't do it and there's no way I'm going to learn this.
Right.
So, I mean, I think we sometimes take a wrong approach there by focusing too much on weaknesses or on where we don't have skills or where we have issues, where there's some problems. All right.
So I have a few more. Do you want to keep going with questions or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, okay. Let's have another question.
We got lots of questions. How to best maximize teen education while their pruning stages are occurring?
I think this is skill building. This is the time for teens. I mean, when they're starting the pruning process, this is really the time for skill building, for practice. And this is where you see a lot in mid and later adolescence. You do see a lot of this. They get into sports, they get into some hobbies they have, and they do hours and hours of this, and they fine-tune their skills. And what we recommend as a really good way of skill building is scaffolding as a teaching strategy. And see, you probably, I assume that you heard about scaffolding as an educational teaching strategy. It's often used in schools for the youth development field or the youth work field. That was kind of a new thing more because there wasn't really as much talked about, and we really have been promoting scaffolding as a way of, it depends on assessing where a young person is at skill level and then provide the support that they can move forward and where they can go by themselves, and then withdraw that support when they're learning and then have them teach it back. So that's really really good way of engaging them. And you can do it in a group too because you have people at different levels. I can show you some resources that you can learn more about this. I don't want to get too much off on that. So
I think that was it. So we can keep going. Thank you.
All right. So, I mean, the takeaways from adolescence, since we really didn't talk about the takeaways from that, but I just want to highlight. So risk-taking is fairly normal and I think can be expected. And for some folks, this is kind of maybe new. For parents, it's probably something they don't want to hear, but that's fairly normal because the emotional system is much stronger, and peer group will also support this. So if peers are around, they're much more likely to act on things that are promising to be exciting, that promise a reward, and the peer group itself could be the reward. So it is very common that risk-taking will happen. It's a little bit filtered by personalities, etc., but overall, it's very common in that age group and should be expected. But you can also turn that around a little bit and really think about ways where can young people take like a risk in a safe environment, and it could be like positive risk taking. It could be something that challenge themselves and they get out of their comfort zone, so that's exciting, and they can learn something in a positive way, in some leadership function, or there's some ideas we could talk about what libraries could do, where young people could take on a leadership role, or you could take on responsibilities that might push their comfort zone. So risk-taking is normal, and the rational brain is a little behind. Even if young people, it's not that they have no sense of consequences. We have here a researcher at Cornell that does research on decision-making, and she's saying clearly that young people know the pros and cons of of situations. They understand the risk involved, but because of the emotional brain firing and being active, they might still make a stupid decision. I mean, even if they know what the consequences are. So it's not that they don't know what the consequences are, they do, but the other stuff is more important. So, okay. So let's talk about some of the key principles. One is really positive, building positive outcomes. And the way we're doing this is really shifting away from fixing problems. And so we're using a framework that Richard Lerner at Tufts University came up with. And he's looking at he wrote a book, The Good Teen, which is a summary of this. I mean, it goes into this in more detail. But we know that young people need a lot of competencies to prepare them for adulthood, for life, for work, for like higher education, depending on what trajectory they're going. And we can break that down into social emotional competencies, intellectual, work readiness, cultural, civic, etc. Then they need confidence. The sense of self-efficacy is really important here. They need to be caring. They need a sense of, or they need, I think, the competency of being empathetic and caring about other people. We know it's extremely important for them to feel connected. The sense of belonging is one of these foundational needs Maslow was talking about. So connection is really important. Making contributions is also very important. Giving back to the community. This is where the sense of agency can come in as well. And also figuring out what the values are they stand for, the character piece. So all of those, this is just a framework to look at what kind of outcomes do we want to build. But we want to build positive outcomes. So that's just one framework. There are other frameworks out there. This one is easier to remember. We call them the 6 C's because they all start with a C. And we really do this in community settings. And I think this is an important thing to remember. So we do this in different ways. So one is we want to make sure that they have the service they need to really function. And these are more the foundational needs that we talked about. So these are the services. In an ideal society, which is not including the US at this point, this healthcare and education should be a basic need that's being met, right? That they can take care of themselves, that all the basic needs are met, and the safety needs, the health needs, the physiological needs, they're all met. And then that happens in a supportive environment, so that relationships, they are supportive relationships that guide young people, that provide guidance, that also provide resources for their emotional well-being. This could be supportive places. The library can be a very supportive setting for young people, as well as the youth program. And the schools are still pretty safe in comparison to some other places. And, but also the relationships, the adult relationships are key here. These are the supports that young people need. And then they need the opportunities to learn skills, to practice skills. They don't learn skills by doing them once, they have to do them repeatedly. We all know that. You don't get good at something doing it one time. So you need opportunities to practice, to generalize it to other settings. You need opportunities for leadership. So young people take the lead there. They're done by young people, but we need to create those opportunities for learning that are a range of opportunities. So this is, I think, how we look at building positive outcomes. We meet, we have the services, we provide the supports, and we have opportunities for them. And this can happen on a community base. It's young people need all of those things, and it happens in the family, it happens in the peer group, it happens in school, it happens in the library, it happens in the community, in public settings, also less often, and it happens in youth service agencies or in other agencies that young people are connected with and interact with people. So we all can take a part in this. It's not something that happens only in one agency. So we can build those positive outcomes in the community in different places, and we should work together on this, that young people do get a range of opportunities and all the supports they need. And how do we build these positive outcomes? And that's where we just talked about this. Instead of highlighting what they're missing or what they're not good at, we focus on their strengths. And we know from resiliency, this is like straight out of resiliency, also this is a social worker who wrote this here. People engage when they can do something, when they have a sense of agency and empowerment. So we know from resiliency that people do have strengths, they have internal resiliencies, they have external support, but often, especially kids who come with with unsupportive environment or like tough neighborhoods or tough families, they might not come knowing what their strengths are. They might not see what their strengths are. And, you know, so it's really a question on how do we help them understand what their own strengths are. But I think the strength-based approach means that we really focus on strengths, trying to identify them, see them, recognize them, help people recognize their own strengths, and that activates them, that empowers them to engage and do something and to develop. They're very motivational too. I mean, you're much more motivated to engage if you can do if you can build on something that you're good at. I think we all know that, right? So we struggled for many years on how youth workers in particular. So how do you find out what young people's strengths are? You ask them, what are your strengths? And then young people say, I don't have any. I don't know what you mean by this. Or they say nothing. So that usually was not a good strategy. So we came up with like some tools, some strategies like inventories. There are inventories online. There are also like activity sheets. We came up with interview guidelines. I mean, there are lots of different ways, but I think what's important is, you know, you identify the strengths and get a sense to young people, what is this? So the Search Institute, which has done a lot of youth development work in Minneapolis, they came up with a new term for this a few years ago, and they call them sparks. And sparks is really the idea that anything that gets you going in the morning, that is a purpose, an interest, a passion, a skill you have. If it's the class clown, a sense of humor, whatever, you know, gets people out of bed in the morning and what they enjoy doing, that's a strength. And so we could use that kind of terminology to find out what people enjoy doing, what they're good at, and use that to build on that, to engage them and then build on that. So there is stuff on the Search Institute website. There also is a very interesting TED Talk by Peter Benson. I mean, he died a couple of years ago, but the TED Talk is from like 2012, I think. It's a great TED Talk I can send you to. It's interesting to think about it this way. And when I do training, a lot of youth workers, whatever their title is, if they work with young people in recreational environments or in special programs or 4-H or whoever, you know, who's in the group, they all take a liking to the spark idea because they like the language. And so it's something to think about. And though when we look at our relationship with young people, like you are in teen libraries or young adult libraries, and you engage with young people, if you look at that relationship you have, what you're trying to accomplish, I think this is this is a fairly recent area of research trying to figure out, how do we define our relationship with young people? We are not a teacher necessarily, we're not a parent. And Search Institute has done some work on this, and I like this model because it tries to break it down a little bit. So it's about support, it's about caring, but it's also about challenging growth. That means that we want to engage them in a way that they move forward, that they are pushing their own comfort level. And that's more than just being a friend or being nice, so it gives a different dimension. So we want to provide support, but we also want to challenge them to learn in a youth-centered way. And that means also maybe sharing some decision-making power and giving up some control. And that's always very hard to do. We'll talk about this when we talk about youth engagement. So that's a kind of more recent piece that kind of fits into this and how we work with young people and what are some of the qualities to look at. And there's a short description of the framework you can download on the Search website. So thinking about this, so positive outcomes, we want to move away from problems, we want to create positive competency-based outcomes, like teaching skills or giving them opportunities to create a sense of belonging, all these kind of things. And then focusing on strengths and not so much on problems, and really help trying to figure out and how to identify what young people are good at and what they care about. So how could you apply this to your work? What does make you, how would you connect this to your work? What did you take away from that? Can I get some chats in or somebody unmute themselves? The chat. I don't see the chat now.
Someone, you don't see the chat? I'll let you know. Someone did say they'd been to a Sparks training. And someone else said that they set 2 teens in front of a laptop yesterday to do some research on Teen Tech Week, which is something that YALSA sponsors. And someone else says they have a teen leadership core that allows teens to make decisions, present programs.
Yeah.
And someone else is inspired by the YALSA competencies. Katie said that in her high school library, she started an advisory committee.
All right, great. We'll talk about that in a second. Yeah. One way to sometimes find just observing teens and looking for, what they enjoy and how they talk about things, engage them in a conversation, and don't go right for or ask them what kind of movies they like or what kind of shows they watch and why do they like them, what does inspire them, and sometimes depending on if they're, if they're coming off very angry, you could also ask them what they are so concerned about or what gets them going there, because we had a youth consultant once who said, for adolescents, sometimes the best way to find out what they really care about is ask them what they're really ticked off about. It could be, you might not feel comfortable doing that, but if you know them a little bit and you have a conversation, you can find out a lot by talking about certain issues. You can talk about the movies or the TV show or the music they listen to and what they like about it and what inspires them there, what gets them going there. And observing and how they talk about this, you identify what they feel strongly about and what their passions are. And I think some of the interests will show up too. So that might be a way of engaging them and use them in your own setting, in your own work, and using that kind of thinking about strength-based. And we do have a lot of stuff on our website, and I'll show you at the end some resources if you want to dig a little deeper there. Given that we 10 more minutes, 15 minutes to go, let's talk about youth engagement. These are great pictures, huh? This is really, I'm very excited about this current activism. So we look at youth engagement really as a user-adult partnership. And this is an old definition, as you can see, that goes way back to 1974. So it's not a new idea. And young people as leaders, as activists, is not a new idea. Activism often driven by young people. And partly it's because of their emotional their limbic system kicking in and being very powerful because they want to see change, they want to do something. You know, like in comparison, like I'm in my 60s, but even in my 50s and 40s, you know, if you talk about something, doing something new, you can immediately think about all the things that get in the way. So you have a great idea, I think that would be a great idea, and then immediately 5 things pop up, this is why it's not going to work. So young people don't think that way. If they have something they feel passionate about and they want to do something, they think about how they're going to get there and not so much on what gets in the way and what other people think about this, and here are the rules and regulations, right? So activism, it comes partly driven because your limbic system is a little bit more active than your prefrontal cortex. But we look at youth engagement really as a partnership because both young people and adults bring expertise to the table. They bring their own perspectives, and they work together to address some genuine needs and create some change, social change. That's how we look at youth engagement on that in the context of positive youth development. So they bring expertise to the table that the other group doesn't have. They learn from each other. So that sounds pretty straightforward, but it's not as straightforward when you think about how what usually happens. Adults usually dominate. So let's take a look at that and how we operationalize this kind of thinking. So we struggled initially, like 15 years ago, I think, when the Office of Family and Children Services, the youth bureaus in New York State, when they promoted bringing young people to their board of directors, a lot of people jumped to this, and they brought one young person to the board of directors, and naturally nothing happened. The young person didn't come back, most likely, because if you have a board of directors where you have 20 adults, 1 youth, what's the power differential, right? And plus, they didn't explain how this works, and they probably didn't even talk to the young person, or they said to the young person, you are representing all young people in our community, which the young person can't do. So there are lots of issues with this, and it didn't work out, backfired. And then often the adults said, we told you so, it doesn't work. So we came up with a framework that kind of tries to break it down a little bit. And so you see here different levels of engagement, and they all bring young people to the table where they have some meaningful responsibilities, they have some decision power, but at the bottom level here in participation, is like they do projects basically, and they can make some decisions, they have some agency there, but overall the project is supervised and framed by adults, all right? And then the next level is more around consultation. So young people come in as the experts. They are the expert for the age group, for where they are, how they experience life at this point. So it could be a youth forum, they could be an advocate for something, it could be a consultant. Now they could be a great media consultant. If you're doing media outreach, social media work, I have some great examples of what young people are capable of, because they are they are early adapters of new technology, so they are much more fit in this than most adults are. There could be an advisory group. I mean, it's more the function is to present perspectives, their opinions from their own perspective. And so there's lots of room for them to provide some input and some consultation. And then at the top layer, we have leadership positions. They could be on the board, but then there should be a group of them on the board. They could be in a hiring committee. I mean, all the youth programs I work with, or agencies I work with that do a lot of youth work, I recommend highly to have young people on the hiring committee for youth workers. Or they could be also in other, board committees where they have some decision power. But this model kind of tries to identify the entry level is really at the bottom, because you have lots of opportunities for young people there. They could be only like 13 or 12. I did co-facilitation with 13-year-olds. They're dynamite in group facilitation if you work with them and prepare with them. And then as they get to know agencies more, they can move up into different roles. So it gives them opportunities to come in, try things out at a very concrete, action-driven level. And then when they learn more about an agency, they can move up to other responsibilities, other roles. So it's a different way of looking at it and gives people more options. And I think it helps get young people engaged and also keep them engaged. And it also helps bring them in earlier, not when they're 18 or 19 and then they go off very soon afterwards to some other things. So it's hard to engage young people over a long period of time. So that's a model we came up with, and I think works a lot better than trying to get them in on the board of directors or pulling together an advisory group right away. So there are lots of meaningful roles young people can have within an organization or within the library too. And we could talk about this. Like you mentioned already, they could be in a technology program. I know there are libraries that do a lot, bring teens in to teach other folks internet use and show them certain things on the computer, or they have reading programs for younger kids, or other things, outreach they could do for the library. Something to think about. So the biggest, I think, challenge with youth engagement is, and it goes a little bit where we started when we talked about how do you engage young people. Well, I think one of the biggest obstacle, or the biggest obstacle is what we call adultism in the youth field. And it's just driven by, as adults, with more life experience, more work experience, with training and expertise and professional development, we know more. And that's true. But because of that, we have some negative attitudes around young people. We'll make assumptions about young people, and that leads to stereotyping young people. And some of it is really ingrained and is very subtle. And a lot of people probably don't recognize or don't realize they're doing this. So when you think about it, like, here's a chance, go back to the good days when you were wearing these things, or other things like that. Think back when you were a teenager or young adult. Were there situations where adults talked down to you or made assumptions about you and then reacted or approached you differently or disrespected you? What did it feel like? I mean, think about it. See, we all have examples for this. I mean, parents telling you, well, when you have your own place, you can do this. I mean, you don't have a say in this because you're under my house, or something like this. But think about this. If you want to share something with the group, get it in. Young adults probably. I mean, if you have young staff, I have this all the time when we have very young adults come in as young professionals. They get treated very differently in an agency too, because they are young, they're early, they're starting out. So they're not taken seriously. And people make sometimes comments, overlook them, make some kind of strange comments that people are insulted, get insulted, rightfully so, because they're not taken seriously.
Yeah, and people are also saying sort of the bias that comes with being a teen when you come
right. And we make assumptions.
Yeah.
We often do. We all do make, I mean, you look at the research that social scientists do on stereotyping and biases. We all have our biases. And that leads me. One thing you could do is go to the Harvard implicit test if you haven't done the test. That will tell you what your biases are. It's a good wake-up call. And it's a very fast, quick response to something you do on the computer. You feed into the ongoing experiment. And you can do it for young adults. You can do it for male, female, ability, disability, race, all kinds of criteria. So you can check what your reactions are. I think we have to be careful that we don't jump to the conclusion that will make the assumptions young people don't know this, or they should know better, whatever our assumptions are. So I think self-reflection is one way to deal with the adultism. Be aware of this. For fun, you could do the Harvard implicit test. You could really get sucked into this, and check your stereotypes on many levels. If you are familiar with active listening, and that goes back to having a conversation, active listening means that you are actually paying attention to the person, and you're not completing their sentences, and you're not providing guidance right away. You let them talk, and you just kind of support them in talking and telling you what they want to tell you. That's sometimes a task that's very hard to do. And even mental health people have a hard time with active listening. And sometimes you reflect back the feelings without, interpreting and judging. So that's a tough one. But that's something that helps too, by not judging too fast to assumptions. But the other thing you could do, we have lots of resources around, if you want to create a youth advisory group, is your agency or your library ready to do this? There's a great manual that you can download for free. Shep Zeldin is from Wisconsin, and we have worked with Shep for many years on developing youth adult resources, partnership resources, or youth leadership resources, and we have a lot on our website. This is kind of a go-to little manual. You can figure out if your agency is really ready to take this on. So I want to just share some resources at the end. I'm aware of the time. We do have a lot on our Act for Youth website. I want to share this with you, and this should open up. Yeah, you see, this is our website. And so we put together a Positive Youth Development 101 online, these are 6 online courses. But so one is kind of an overview thing. They're animated little courses. You have to do a little assignments. You have some reading and more in-depth reading if you want to, but you also have some little video animations. There's one on puberty and adolescence. We together with the social media lab here at Cornell University, we put a thing together on youth and technology because the cyberspace is such an important influence right now. And research that's going on is kind of, it depends. We don't know exactly yet what all the impact will be, but it has a discussion of what we know so far and the positive and the negatives that come with it. We have one here on programming, and this is, that has a scaffolding in it and how to give good feedback, how to do experiential learning settings, that kind of stuff. There's one on youth voice and then one on youth work ethics too, and boundaries. And so that might not be of interest to you, but these are all free. You just have to sign on. You go to this link up on top, this link here, you sign on and there's like 30-minute mini courses and you can take all or one or whatever. But there's a lot of resources connected to this. So while I have you on this website, this website has a lot of resources. This web section has a lot of resources on here. So the whole training, there's a whole training manual on there if you're interested in this, the online courses, but it has also something here on competencies, also something on inclusiveness, which is on biases. And I think it refers you also to the project implicit, to the Harvard study, etc. So the other thing in Act for Youth is we do have an adolescent toolkit, and I have the links on the slides. I'll just show you directly here where things are. So we have a whole toolkit on here, web-based resources from TED Talks to research articles, you name it, on these domains of development, identity, risk-taking, teens and media, etc. And then all resources for programs and resources for parents and teens as well. There's some really good interactive web pages, websites out there for teens. And then our youth development section has a lot of the material are covered on it with special readings, etc. And publications, there's some fact sheets you might be interested in. So we have a lot of stuff on the website. Oh, and if I go back to this one here, if you're interested in some details on strengths, how to build strengths, etc., we have a social and emotional learning toolkit that gives you all those competencies here, like self-management. You have lots of resources on here you can go to. They're all web-based, or you can download them. So we kind of served what's out there and connected people with this. So lots of stuff. And I know library folks like to read. So I also wanted to share with you here the resources, direct links to this, but I also wanted to show a few books with you. Larry Steinberg's book, Age of Opportunity, is a great overview of adolescent development and how to work with adolescents. Dana Boyd is a great book if you're interested in the media aspect, the social media aspect. It's complicated, the social lives of network teens, and I think recognizing that public spaces are getting smaller and smaller for teens, partly because of fear that they're not safe, partly because there are rules against teens. So the public spaces they go to are online. That's where the social media platforms come in. This book, if you Google it, you can download the whole book on her website. She has a website and she makes the whole book available online. And then an overview of adolescent development. The most recent, most up-to-date one is from Johns Hopkins, and that is like 100-page book you can download for free from their website. The Age of Opportunity you have to purchase. But Larry Steinberg has a lot of his research articles available on his website, which we also have listed in the Adolescent Toolkit, I think. So I think that's it. Yes, it is.
Thank you so much, Jutta. That was amazing. Some people have had to leave, but they're all saying this was great. Thank you. Really informative. So this was really awesome. A great way to kick off our competencies webinars, and also just somebody else said they're inspired to get back into it. So I really appreciate it. People have been asking, the slides and the recording and the chat transcript will all be available tomorrow. Everyone who registered will get all that info. There will also be an evaluation, and if you would like a certificate of attendance, you can email me and I will get you that, but all of that info will be available tomorrow. Thank you again very much, Jutta. That was amazing. And thank you all for being here today. Hope to see you again next month.
All right, thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.